Good morning and welcome to Rising. We have a great show for you today. I'm Amber Duke, back at our table with Niall Standage.
Great to be with you, Amber. It has been a little while, so I'm glad to see you again.
It's nice to see you as well. How have you been?
I've been fine, thank you. I was off. My mother was visiting from Ireland, so that was nice. And otherwise off for a little while. I hope I'm not too rusty for our debates, but I'm looking forward to it.
I'm sure you'll be great. And plus, there's a lot of really interesting news stories today we're blessed to cover.
We definitely do. We have been blessed by the news gods with plenty of things to talk about, for sure.
Coming up on Rising, we'll discuss the latest in the Hamas-Israel ceasefire deal and President Trump's warning for the terrorist organization if they don't disarm.
Plus, the State Department has revoked the visas of foreign nationals who are accused of celebrating Charlie Kirk's death, raising free speech issues.
And HHS Secretary Robert F. Kennedy Jr.'s wife was on The View, and things got a bit testy.
But first, Defence Secretary Pete Hegseth getting some pushback from his own former employer, that's Fox News, over his new rules for the press.
Fox signed on to a statement from ABC, NBC, CBS, and CNN saying that none of them would agree to new Pentagon press rules, saying, quote, "The policy is without precedent and threatens core journalistic protections. So far, One American News has been the only media outlet to sign."
Despite the pushback, Hegseth and the Pentagon still insist that the new rules are a reasonable request in the interests of national security. But retired General Jack Keane rejected that idea on Fox News last night.
What they're really doing, they want to spoon feed information to the journalists, and that will be their story. That's not journalism. Journalism is going out and finding the story and getting all the facts to support it. And no one's going to walk in and bang on a door of a four-star general or senior civilian policy leader in the Pentagon. I never had that, but I did have journalists chasing a story of something that was going on in the Army, and those things were legitimate.
But Department spokesperson Sean Parnell says the claim that the Pentagon wants to spoon-feed stories is a lie. He writes on X, "It should come as no surprise that the mainstream media is once again misrepresenting the Pentagon's press procedures. Let's be absolutely clear. Journalists are not required to clear their stories with us. This claim is a lie. Have an escort in sensitive areas. Wear a press credential. Don't encourage our people to violate Department of War policy. Pretty simple." And some on the right say that they agree. Eric Doherty of Florida Voice News posted this to X after the Associated Press and New York Times refused to sign Monday, writing in part, "Okay, kick them out. Access to the Pentagon without basic security measures is not a right."
The deadline to acknowledge Hegseth's new rules was yesterday, and for those who have not signed, he has promised to evict them from the building today. So I think this is really an interesting story, Amber. We should, I think, in the interest of full transparency, say The Hill has declined to sign and the Daily Caller, your news organisation, has also declined to sign. It's only One American News that has signed up. I was kidding offline about welcoming you to the resistance and all of that, but to be a bit more serious, I actually do think it is to the credit of the Daily Caller, of Fox News, and a couple of other conservative-leaning outlets that they have declined to sign this policy, which I certainly see as a heavy-handed attempt to essentially prohibit reporters from reporting all but the most acceptable or cleared news.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, the problem with the policy is that it goes way too far. I think it's understandable that the Pentagon wants to prevent leaks of classified information, but that's a question of making sure your own employees are not doing that, not of trying to hamstring the press. And my understanding, I have not been a Pentagon reporter, is that the hallway that they are asking reporters to get escorted around has always been open for the press to roam freely, and it even is apparently labeled that it's basically the reporter's
corridor,
the press corridor.
Right.
So basically, to go from the briefing room to the office where all of the press desks are set up, they now have to have an official walking with them. And in addition, it says not just that classified leaks are prohibited, but that the press is not allowed to report on any classified or unclassified information that is not approved by a Pentagon official. So I was just thinking, well, what would this mean for previous major national security stories. When Edward Snowden did his infamous leaks proving that the NSA was spying on Americans, the press would, if they published that under this policy, be prohibited from further accessing the Pentagon. And so that's really the danger here in restricting that type of reporting.
Right. And to that point, I think that a lot of the purported security concerns that the Pentagon and Pete Hegseth are claiming here were already honoured by news organisations in previous iterations before this policy. So this idea, for example, that the press was sort of roaming into areas where they were not permitted, and this sort of rather dramatic image of the media as if they're just sort of sneaking into people's offices. That was not happening. Reporters at the Pentagon wear badges as it is to identify themselves. There have been numerous instances in the past where news organizations have discovered things that are classified and have had discussions with the administration of the day as to whether they can permissibly report that without endangering people's lives. And that's, of course, a valid concern. But this seems to me a lot more about chilling genuine reporting and trying to control access in a way that infringes not only on press freedom, but on the public's right to know what this organisation that has massive funding is of massive importance is actually doing.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And this is not the first time that we have seen an administration try to curtail press freedom. During the previous administration, there were 400 hard passes to the White House that were revoked from various press organizations and individuals. And then, of course, there was the scandalous Obama administration spying on journalists who were reporting on similar information. So, although not without precedent, obviously concerning. And I think the fact that there's only been one outlet that's signed on to this and that is going to be present in the Pentagon is probably going to force them to rethink this, because whatever type of coverage you want, whether it's positive or negative, and sometimes administrations, don't mind negative coverage if it means that what they're doing is getting out to the public, or that they're getting some attention for what's going on. As some would say, all press is good press. Well, in this case, there's potentially no press.
Right, and I wonder how that's going to be received by President Trump, actually, because for all his blasts at the media, he loves media attention.
Right.
And the fact that this has gone so far where organizations like your own, like Fox News, are declining to sign and therefore will presumably be barred from going there, what impact will that have? I also think it looks pretty bad for One American News to be the sole people who have signed up to this. So I think that's part of the picture as well. As far as previous administrations, I think it's fair to raise all those issues. I would have bigger problems with the Obama era spying or surveillance. The issue of press passes in the last administration was a bit cloudy to me because it wasn't clear whether those were people who were simply not showing up to use those passes. I'm not persuaded that was viewpoint discrimination or an attempt to silence the press, but certainly it is valid to cite previous examples.
Yeah, I think one of the bigger concerns actually during the Biden administration, in addition to the revocation of White House hard passes, was they had a very restrictive COVID policy when it came to attending press briefings. So it was very difficult for smaller outlets to be able to attend. So at the time I was working for The Spectator, we were basically a startup in the United States, and yet we were expected to pay for a daily COVID test at a cost of $150 just to be able to access the briefing room, which obviously was prohibitively expensive for us. And so sometimes these rules that are seemingly done for the reason of public health or what have you ended up disproportionately punishing outlets who do not have these massive budgets or are not owned by corporations or billionaires.
Raising the bar for access without saying
Exactly.
so. Yeah, fair enough.
All right, coming up, President Trump is vowing that Hamas will disarm, and if they don't, there may be violent consequences.
The Israel-Hamas ceasefire deal is already experiencing some tension. On Tuesday, Hamas returned the remains of 4 more hostages after Israel had threatened to cut half of its promised aid to Gaza.
Israel alleged that Hamas was not being compliant with the deal, as the terrorist organization promised to return 28 deceased hostages, but has only returned 8. Israel says that the handover is moving slower than expected. President Trump weighed in on the matter on Truth Social yesterday, writing, "All 20 hostages are back and feeling as good as can be expected. A big burden has been lifted, but the job is not done. The dead have not been returned as promised. Phase 2 begins right now." President DJT.
During the negotiations, Hamas said that they don't know the exact locations of many of the deceased hostages, but still promised to return the bodies. Israel Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu backed the plan to halve the promised aid to Gaza if more bodies weren't returned. According to the Jerusalem Times, however, Israel has reopened the Rafah border crossing after Hamas returned the most recent hostages.
Another important aspect of the deal is disarming Hamas. President Trump was asked about that yesterday at the White House. Here's what he had to say.
We have told them we want to disarm, and they will disarm. And if they don't disarm, we will disarm them. And it'll happen quickly and perhaps violently. But they will disarm. Do you understand me?
Dropsite News journalist Jeremy Scahill wrote on X, "During Gaza negotiations, Israel understood it would take time to recover all bodies of deceased captives. A specific mechanism for recovering the bodies was agreed. Now Israel is pretending that didn't happen, so it can violate the deal and cut the agreed aid shipments in half."
Meanwhile, others are pointing to a video that shows Hamas holding public executions, reportedly to punish alleged criminals and collaborators with Israel. Rebel News reporter Avi Yamini wrote on X, "Hamas is back to slaughtering their own people, and like clockwork, the pro-Palestine mobs in the West have gone dead silent. 2 years of screaming at Israel, and now nothing."
A lot to get to there, Amber. Firstly, on the issue of the deceased hostages. Obviously, it's a very macabre topic by its nature. It does not appear to me that Hamas has violated what was agreed to, because an Israeli journalist with the state broadcaster was the first person that I saw find or to reveal the written agreement for this phase of the deal. And it did note, as Jeremy Scahill noted, that there was a recognition that Hamas did not know, in fact, where all the bodies of the deceased hostages were, and that it would endeavour to find out as soon as possible and would return the deceased that were in its possession. But there was this mechanism to find out more. So grim though it all is, I'm not persuaded at all that they actually violated the deal.
The only thing that I think cuts against that argument is that after Israel threatened to cut this aid, they were somehow immediately able to return more of the remains, right?
I actually think that's the wrong chronology. Now, correct me if I'm wrong. I believe that they had released 4 hostages. Israel said we're not going to put in the aid, and then they released, I believe they did release new hostages before Israel changed the policy there. So I'm not, maybe I have the chronology wrong, but I'm not entirely sure that, I think they were always going to release the 8.
Okay, one of the other interesting things is that they also apparently returned the remains of someone that didn't match with the missing hostages. So I'm curious what was going on there as well.
Yeah, that seems a mysterious one, that Israel says that the DNA of one of the bodies that was returned does not match any hostage. I do think it's worth noting, Amber, there have also been deceased people returned in the other direction, as it were. And CNN has a very impactful report today about those 45 of those bodies, Palestinians, who were, the corpses were handcuffed and had their legs cuffed, and some were blindfolded, and some had evidence of being shot in the head. That is obviously very ominous and very bleak in itself. We don't know the full story on that score. All of these things, I think, point to the fact that even at this stage of the proceedings through this first phase of a peace deal, it's obviously very fraught. These are very emotionally potent topics for entirely obvious reasons. And you have two sides that are enormously mistrustful of each other.
Right.
So this is not going to be a smooth process, I don't think.
No, I don't think so either. And I obviously want to reiterate, as I believe we have several times on this show, how historic it was and how important it was for even the outline of a peace deal to be achieved, and most importantly, the remaining hostages being returned, and Israel, of course, returning some as well. And I think Trump deserves enormous credit for that. The next part is what's going to be perhaps the most challenging, which is getting both sides to agree to what the next steps of the deal are, and also ultimately, what is it going to look like for Gaza to be led by some independent authority, for Hamas to disarm and to no longer be in control of that region.
Yeah, I think anyone who arrives at a peace deal, and I've said this elsewhere, who gets a cessation of a military campaign and therefore creates conditions in which people are alive who would otherwise be dead, deserves credit for that. I've also said, and I'll reiterate here, that to move away from any partisanship in all of this, I have very little patience with the Biden officials who I think are now trying to sort of cleanse or launder their own reputations by talking up their own role in this, when I would have been, and still am, very critical of them for not putting enough pressure on to get to this point earlier. Trump, for all his unpredictability, did actually put some pressure on Netanyahu, it seems, to get to this point. And I think that's a very valid point.
That is an important thing to raise, because Biden himself did that in his statement that he released this week, where he was talking about how they had basically laid the groundwork for this, and all that Trump did was get it over the finish line.
Right.
It's like,
that's not what happened.
That's definitely not what happened.
Right.
And yes, and we have talked on this program about how Trump was really publicly saber-rattling Netanyahu and saying how frustrated he was with his unwillingness or inability to reach some kind of agreement with Hamas. He talked about the fact that Israel was not abiding by what the U.S. necessarily wanted it to do in order to get to this point. And I think the difference is, frankly, that other countries actually believe Trump when he says these things publicly and threatens to get aggressive with them. I think they believe that he will follow through, and having that type of backing of that believability of, well, Trump actually might do something to us, can be very compelling for someone who otherwise would be would see this as maybe some kind of signal to his base. Like, no, Israel actually apparently believed that Trump was willing to hold them accountable.
Yeah, I mean, as you know, I am massively critical of him in various ways, particularly in the domestic arena, and we may get to some of those issues later in today's show. But I do think his inherent volatility can actually be sometimes useful in negotiating situations, especially on the international stage. I wanted to get to your point about the legitimacy of whoever does ultimately end up governing Gaza, but I believe we're almost out of time of this segment, so maybe we'll have some other time.
Well, that's a shame. Yeah, we'll have to
get
be back on together soon.
Some other occasion. Up next, President Trump is saying that the U.S. military has struck another boat off the waters of Venezuela, but a Democratic senator is sounding the alarm. Stay with us for that. President Trump has announced that the U.S. has struck another vessel accused of carrying drugs in the waters near Venezuela, killing 6 people.
This is now the 5th such strike against alleged drug traffickers, whom the Trump administration calls unlawful combatants. The president wrote in part on Truth Social, quote, "Intelligence confirmed the vessel was trafficking narcotics, was associated with illicit narco-terrorist networks, and was transiting along a known DTO route. The strike was conducted in international waters, and 6 male narco-terrorists aboard the vessel were killed in the strike. No U.S. forces were harmed." Thank you for your attention to this matter.
Some are sounding the alarm over the Trump administration not going through Congress first to conduct these kinds of strikes. California Senator Adam Schiff wrote on X, "The president's authorities under Article 2 are limited to responding to an armed attack or the threat of an imminent armed attack, and do not apply here. These continued strikes, 27 killed to date, risk getting the US into a full-fledged war. Senator Tim Kaine and I forced a bipartisan vote to block these strikes last week. If they continue, we will do so again." I think we have different views on this matter, but I do want to say that in addition to Adam Schiff, Rand Paul, Republican senator from Kentucky, has been very much to the fore in criticizing these kinds of actions and in strongly arguing that the administration, the president, need congressional authorization. And I think he's right about that. I don't like this sense that we can just go around blowing boats out of the water on the word of the President or the word of the Secretary of Defense or Secretary of War, if you want to call him that. I think that is, just obvious lawlessness that is becoming more normalized. But I think you have a different view, perhaps.
Yeah, I mean, I view these as terrorist organizations, which of course the President has designated them as. And I think that one of the arguments in favor of this would be that when Adam Schiff brings up the idea that you can only do these kinds of strikes to defend from an imminent attack, that the drug crisis that we have in this country and the amount of dead American bodies that we have because of these narco-terrorists is an imminent attack, them trafficking these drugs through international waters. But I will give Senator Rand Paul this. He's been incredibly consistent on his views of the president's needing congressional authority to conduct certain types of foreign policy. He was saying it during the Obama administration with the endless drone strikes, and he's saying it now with the strikes from the narco-terrorist boats. So I think he's at least logically consistent.
Yeah, he is. I mean, I sometimes agree with him, sometimes disagree with him, but I think he genuinely holds to his principles in these matters. I think that my view or difference with the view that you have just expressed is the idea that which you're positing, that the importation of drugs by individuals, cartels, is an act of war. I just don't think that that is how we have typically defined acts of war. I don't think it therefore really runs here. But let's say hypothetically one accepts that premise. The proof that has been provided in these cases is still very, very scant. I think there was one instance where there was an argument that there had been cocaine found in the waters around a boat. Otherwise, it's just basically take our word for it. And I have huge difficulties with that.
Yeah, I understand that. And obviously it would be difficult for them to release information that could lead to the disclosure of confidential sources and methods or intelligence procedures that allowed them to determine that these individuals were in fact trafficking drugs and were part of a terrorist or cartel group. But I do think when looking at cartels as terrorist organizations, you do have to look at the totality of the circumstances and what these organizations do, which is not just selling drugs or trafficking drugs, but also human trafficking at the southern border. The cartels effectively control the entire Mexican side of the southern border that it shares with the U.S. They decide who goes through. I've talked to numerous immigration experts, people who live on the border, about this. They have made very clear that you do not get to pass into the U.S. unless you pay the cartel or the cartel gives you permission. So they are acting basically as a state actor in that way. And they also, of course, get involved in politics with the way that they kill their political opponents. They pay off the government. So to me, the totality of the circumstances there is what renders them designated as terrorist organizations.
Yeah, I just don't agree that they can be seen as a state actor. And in fact, there was an intelligence analysis earlier this year from the Trump administration that cast doubt on how much the Maduro government was cooperating with them.
Well, we will certainly keep an eye on it, continue to have that debate. The State Department says it is revoking visas of foreign nationals who celebrated the murder of Charlie Kirk. But the move is raising questions from some about free speech. Stick around.
The State Department has revoked the visas of 6 people over accusations that they praised or celebrated the assassination of Charlie Kirk.
On X, the department writes, the United States has no obligation to host foreigners who wish death on Americans. The State Department continues to identify visa holders who celebrated the heinous assassination of Charlie Kirk. The President and Secretary Rubio will defend our borders, our culture, and our citizens by enforcing our immigration laws. Aliens who take advantage of America's hospitality while celebrating the assassination of our citizens will be removed. The department went on to list the 6 cases of foreign nationals who it says have now had their visas revoked. Most of them involved social media posts accusing Kirk of spreading racist or fascist rhetoric. The department did not specify what types of visas they held or whether they are currently living in the U.S.
The move is sparking some debate over free speech and whether or not visa holders have the same First Amendment rights as U.S. citizens. YouTuber and writer Brad Polumbo says on X, I condemn the substance of all of these social media posts, but most appear to be within the scope of the First Amendment. Revoking visas of legal residents for First Amendment protected speech, and I believe they are entitled to First Amendment rights, isn't constitutional. Attorney Ryan Mullally responded saying, quote, "I don't think there is clear case law controlling the extent of visa holders' First Amendment rights. We know they have such rights, but not how far they extend. Likely this issue will be teed up for the court sooner than later."
This news comes after President Trump honored Charlie Kirk with a posthumous Medal of Freedom on Tuesday, which would have been Kirk's 32nd birthday. His widow, Erica Kirk, accepted the award on his behalf, saying the president's support is something that she will cherish forever.
So obviously there's a lot to discuss here, Amber. You and I did this show very soon after Charlie Kirk's killing, and you knew him and had spoken to him numerous times. So, I mean, I have views on the politics of this, but why don't you sort of lead with what you think of all this?
Yeah, sure. Well, I think the really key thing here is that having a visa is a privilege, not a right. And the State Department can revoke a visa or grant a visa basically at its pleasure. There are some, obviously, rules that apply to visa holders, but ultimately the State Department gets the final say. They get to decide who comes into the U.S. and who does not. And I think there's a really great case to be made that someone who celebrates or is accepting of the murder of an American citizen who was merely exercising his free speech rights is a very good reason not to want that person in the country. I
would put the emphasis, I suppose, in a different place. Now, I'm in a slightly awkward position because it feels to me a little bit like I'm defending the rights of people who are insulting a friend of yours who was killed. And
I think you should speak freely. I'll be all right. I'm a big girl.
Well, that's fair enough. To my mind, the issue here is a kind of thin end of the wedge or slippery slope argument, because I see this in the context of various efforts by this administration that I see as aimed at the curtailment of free speech. So I think that is visible in relation to law firms, in relation to universities, in relation to some individuals. I mean, there was the woman, the Tufts student, who was detained in very murky circumstances where her wrongdoing appeared to have been writing an op-ed that was critical of Israel. That young woman was subsequently released. The State Department released the 6 quotes from some of the people. Now, to my mind, the evidence there is mixed. There are some that I wouldn't defend, and I have my phone out because I'm looking at them, where some of it is sort of like, there was one that said he didn't die, he died too late. Now, I think you can legitimately cast that as an incitement to violence. But there are other things like, for example, where a Mexican national said that Kirk, quote, died being a racist, he died being a misogynist. I don't, to me, I mean, that's a point of view that I would imagine lots of people who like Charlie Kirk find very offensive. But to my mind, that is not sufficient to try to expel someone from the country, which is what has effectively been done by revoking a visa. There was another one from a South African where, now he does refer to defenders of Kirk as Neanderthals, but he talks about believing that it was a racist rally, and Charlie Kirk won't be remembered as a hero. He was used to astroturf a movement of white nationalist trailer trash. Again, a strong view, but like, is it calling on people to commit crime? Is it inciting violence? I would argue no. And my bigger argument, I guess, is that when you start curtailing those kind of comments from people who have visas, then it's the beginning of a slippery slope where you try and curtail them for other people.
Yeah, so I mean, ultimately this comes down to a where you draw the line question, right? Which is, if you are in the business of deciding who comes into the United States on a visa, is awarded that privilege, then should we guarantee them all of the same free speech rights as Americans? Should we only draw the line at speech that is outside the scope of the First Amendment, such as incitement of violence? Or do we think there should actually be some viewpoint discrimination in who gets to come to the U.S. and who is granted that privilege? I think there should be some viewpoint discrimination to make sure that their cultural values align with what we want to see, and also that we're not bringing in people who either hate a certain political class of people or who hate American culture or values. And in this case, I think, dancing on the grave of someone who was assassinated is one of those values that I do not want to see visa holders have. Of course, there's always the danger of an administration who disagrees with me getting the State Department's power and deciding that they don't want to let in people who have conservative viewpoints. That's a concern. I think it's one that honestly I'm willing to take to get rid of people who would laugh at or celebrate the murder of Charlie.
You see, where I think I have difficulties, I mean, it's genuinely an interesting debate to have about who you let into the country and what importance you ascribe to their political or cultural views. Now, if someone was, for example, calling for the mass subjugation of women, right? I think that is questionable whether you want someone with that view in the country. If someone is outwardly calling for mass acts of violence, then I think that, or advocating for support of armed actions, I think that is questionable. When you get into things like cultural values, my concern there is that it can be interpreted by whatever administration is in power to simply prohibit people who have different political views. And I'm not sure that we want to be in the situation of conditioning entry into this country upon political views that would be valid for an American citizen to hold. You see the distinction I'm trying to get at?
I think for me, it's less of a political question than it is a values-based question. So I would actually feel the same way about someone who said, for example, that Hassan Piker would deserve to die because he abused his dog on his Twitch stream.
Right.
That person I would equally not want in the country because I don't want anyone coming here who is willing to justify the killing of someone because they held different political views, even if I don't share those political views.
Right. Okay. I mean, I think that's fair enough. Obviously, I just think that when we hand over or acknowledge the power of the government to do these things, we, I think, do need to be careful about not just suggesting that we can, an administration can import, as it were, people who they think agree with them and bar people who they think disagree with them. I think that's the danger here. People who have vigorous opposition to Charlie Kirk or Hassan Piker, I'm fine with. People who are calling for people like that to be shot dead, I have problems with. And I think that's, to me, the distinction is one of, are you advocating criminal action? Or are you simply expressing a view that some people find objectionable? Which is,
and I would obviously draw the line a little bit differently, which is it doesn't have to be an act of incitement, but if you are justifying or okay with, then I think that's sufficient enough to deny or revoke a visa. Now, I'm curious about what one of the individuals we talked about in the intro, what the courts would say on this matter, right? Because we have had this really high-profile case of Mahmoud Khalil, who was able to be removed from the country, and I think that would probably set a baseline where the State Department would probably prevail on this question.
Yeah, I mean, that question's an interesting one, though, because this is the thing about excluding people who have adverse effects on the foreign policy interests of the United States or something.
Question.
Which, that I think is really interesting, whether it only applies to obviously political actors, like if you're the member of a particular political party, or whether it applies to people who are just espousing particular views. In any event, actress and wife of Robert F. Kennedy Jr. and star of Curb Your Enthusiasm, Cheryl Hines, got into it with Sonny Hostin on The View yesterday. Stay with us for that. Actress and wife of Robert F. Kennedy Jr., Cheryl Hines, got into a testy exchange with Sonny Hostin during her appearance on The View on Tuesday. Hines was on The View to discuss her new memoir, Unscripted. But, of course, the subject of her husband came up. Let's listen.
Your husband is the least qualified Department of Health and Human Services head that we've had in history.
I do not.
I think that's a very dangerous.
Why is he less qualified than an economist?
I think
How is
that he
possible?
is less qualified.
He has spent his career studying toxins, studying people's health, fighting for one guy who was using Roundup for his job.
He has also spread a lot of misinformation, a lot of chaos.
Kennedy has been in the news recently over his efforts to find potential causes of autism. And most recently, Kennedy stated during a cabinet meeting that there were 2 studies that show children who are circumcised early have double the rate of autism. He said that it's likely because they are given Tylenol in the process of healing from those circumcisions. Here's some more of Hines and Hostin's exchange.
We could go back to COVID when...
He's connecting circumcision to autism.
May I finish?
Please.
When people, Fauci, people were saying when you get the vaccine, you cannot transmit COVID. It will stop COVID. And that was disinformation, misinformation.
We were also still learning about it. It was a novel virus we've never encountered before.
Right.
Because now the doctors will acknowledge that you
And
can't.
Dr. Fauci has a medical degree.
Many experts, of course, disagree with Kennedy's suggestions. Founder and medical director of Ocean Pediatrics, Dr. Stephen Abelowitz, told CBS News, quote, "The conclusion by any credible medical resource is agreeing that there is no causal relationship between Tylenol, circumcisions, or vaccines to autism." Well, I did not expect to be discussing circumcisions with you today, this morning, Amber, but here we are. And Cheryl Hines going on The View. Look, I mean, I've been critical of Robert F. Kennedy Jr. numerous times. I think, although some of his viewpoints regarding, for example, additives in food and so on, I've sympathy for, I do think he has propagated pretty misleading theories about vaccines and autism. And I don't have a whole lot of time for him. I think Cheryl Hines going on The View, good for her. I know she has a book to sell, but she also knew she was entering hostile territory there. And so it proved. What do you make of it all?
It's really interesting. I always find it fascinating in terms of what people expect spouses of political figures to say exactly. Right. Like, do they think that she's going to go on The View and disavow her husband?
Right.
If so, they have a very sad view of marriage, I think. But I think she did a good job. She was obviously prepared. She was willing to have that debate with them. She didn't, say, like, I'm not going to talk about my husband's work. She was willing to go there, which I think is really kudos to her. She hasn't spoken much publicly about his tenure at HHS. And it was nice to see her defend him. And I think it was interesting when Sunny immediately starts with this pretty hefty accusation that RFK is the least qualified HHS secretary in history. And she goes, well, was an economist more qualified? Or I think the previous one was an attorney. So it was kind of like, what are you talking about, lady?
Yeah, I mean, the Economist thing, just in terms of debate, the Economist response was a good rejoinder. It refers to an Obama era
I believe
HHS
so.
secretary,
and then
I think.
Becerra was, his entire career was a lawyer.
Okay, so that's a fair point to make. I think also just in terms of the mechanics of debate, going at her on the basis of RFK Jr.'s qualifications, I mean, that's not even the tack I would take if I was trying to do an adversarial interview with Cheryl Hines, because I think the issue is what RFK Jr. believes, what he has propagated, whether those beliefs hold up. I'm generally skeptical of arguments about qualification for political office. It's like when people talk about, in presidential races, well, is he or she qualified to be president? Like, what job actually qualifies you to be president? That seems a highly dubious maneuver. And even to put sort of partisan questions aside, whenever Hillary Clinton ran against Barack Obama for the Democratic nomination in 2008, he was much less qualified in the judgment of me and the plurality of Democratic voters. He was the much better candidate. So that particular criteria for political office, I think, is dubious. I think it's completely valid in things like scientific positions and so on. But to be a cabinet secretary or to run for office, I'm just not so sure about it.
Yeah, and I think it gets at this sort of rub between the expert or credentialed class versus a more populist view of politics, which is people who don't have a credential or a specific educational achievement can still be well qualified because they present great ideas, or they're able to critically think through problems, and maybe the people who work underneath them are really well qualified experts who can help them execute a vision for the country, which I think is what's happening within HHS. I mean, you'll recall at that announcement about the potential link between Tylenol and autism, that's standing around RFK Jr., who himself is not a doctor, were Dr. Marty Makary, Dr. Jay Bhattacharya, and Dr. Mehmet Oz, who are all very well qualified and really leaders in their field. And I know
I'm smirking about Dr. Oz because of the pushing of dubious cures, but
I understand his television show was not the ideal, but he did have a very accomplished medical career before that. Dr. Jay Bhattacharya was at Stanford, Dr. Marty Makary was at Johns Hopkins. They were both incredibly well respected, and the only reason that people sneer at them now is because in Dr. Bhattacharya's case, he signed on to the Great Barrington Declaration. Dr. Marty Makary also raised questions about the COVID pandemic response, and so they were sort of cast out as doctors that were right-wing or were politicizing medicine, when really they were asking legitimate questions, I think, about what the government was doing in terms of its public health reaction to COVID, and otherwise nobody would have ever questioned their credentials.
The Barrington Declaration, I think, is an interesting debate in and of itself. I do think that it was part of a valid debate. I think there were real dangers to what the people who signed up to that were proposing, but that'll get us down the COVID rabbit hole again, and we'll be there for for quite a long time. I think that the fear that people like myself and other skeptics of RFK have is the idea that he is prone to deciding the conclusion before looking impartially at the evidence. So things like the Tylenol or the circumcisions, or even the idea that a cause for autism will be found within a certain time frame. I think those kind of conditions raise pretty serious questions about whether this is in fact a good faith, rigorous scientific effort or an effort to reach a preordained conclusion.
Yeah, I have so much more to say.
I know.
I wish we had more time. All right, Instagram has a new setting for teenagers that it hopes will give parents a better idea of what their kids are seeing on the app. We'll be right back with more about that after this. Instagram is introducing stricter guidelines for its teenage users. The app's parent company Meta announced Tuesday that teen accounts will now be set to a PG-13 setting by default.
Teen accounts is a set of protections introduced by the app last year that applies to users from ages 13 through 17. The goal now is for those accounts to see content that is similar to what they would be able to see in a PG-13 movie. Here's the head of Instagram explaining why the company is making the changes.
Teens are at an age where they're trying to figure out who they are in the world, and exploring their interests is one of the most important ways to do that with friends. So our responsibility is to maximize positive experiences and minimize negative experiences. And so we want to make sure that we do just that, and that people feel good about the time that they spend on Instagram. So we've got a lot of tools, not just for parents, but for teens directly, that try and focus the experience on what's more positive.
A statement from Meta says teens can opt out of this new setting with the parent's permission, or parents can choose an even more restrictive setting if they want. A survey from Ipsos on behalf of Meta found that 96% of parents appreciate having these content options.
But online, some are raising concerns over what these new guidelines mean. Libby Emmons, editor-in-chief of the Post-Millennial, writes on X, "Sure, standards are good, but this is more Hollywood influence on our lives. The Hollywood definitions of what is offensive and what isn't will be fed to the next generation via Insta."
And Missouri Senator Josh Hawley weighed in, asking for more transparency. He says Zuckerberg should come to Capitol Hill and tell senators about his plans to overhaul Meta's apps. While he's at it, let's slap age verifications on chatbots too, so they stop killing our kids.
Well, I mean, I don't really have any objection to what Meta is doing here, or Instagram, or however you want to phrase it. It seems that it's common sense to not have just everything available to people in early adolescence or younger than that. I don't I mean, I just don't have any particular objection to it. The reasons why they're doing it may be more open to question. They're being sued by 40 states, apparently, in terms of the idea that the apps have harmful psychological effects on people at a very early stage in life. So they may well be acting under pressure. But I don't object to the thing itself.
No, me neither. I think it seems fairly obvious that children who are on social media should not be exposed to the same content that adults are. Now, if it were me, my kid just wouldn't have an Instagram. but
banned from social media forever.
Oh yeah, they won't have phones.
Okay.
And everybody always says, "Well, just wait till you have kids. They're gonna." And I know so many parents who do not give their kids phones. It's really not that difficult. You just don't do it. Yeah. And you're their parent. You're not their friend, right? So you have to be able to make those hard decisions, even when they might hate you for a little minute. I think they'll get over it. But yeah, there's this really interesting question happening in American life and culture about really who's responsible for the negative mental health impact of social media. Is it parents? Is it the companies? I think the answer is both. And a lot of schools now across the country have banned phones from not just the classrooms, but when the students get there, they actually have to put them in a pouch that blocks the signal, and they're not allowed to access that at all throughout the school day. And they've reported really great responses from students actually who enjoy not having the phones. They get to interact more. They're actually talking to each other at the lunch table or at recess instead of sitting there on their social media apps. And I think that's a really great development. And now that people are waking up to really the potential harm of these devices for kids, we've seen a lot of really great actions and solutions to making sure that kids are protected and able to actually grow up and have a normal childhood.
Yeah, I mean, quite aside from inappropriate content, I think the point you raise about schools is really vital, because as a person who is now 51, I do think that attention spans have pretty clearly declined or contracted within my memory, and I was of a generation that grew up before social media. But I think that the constant presence of screens and an avalanche of information, and constantly being able to switch, watching TV with one hand and watching your phone with the other, that sort of stuff is just, I think, detrimental.
Yeah, and also the idea of doing all of your schoolwork on a computer and maybe the use of AI tools.
Right.
I mean, I remember we had blue books, right?
Yeah.
We had to write everything
Exactly.
down. There was no technology assisting us, so not that I'm that much smarter than those kids. That's going to do it for us on Rising Live. Look out for more exclusive YouTube content coming your way today. Be sure to like, share, and subscribe to the Hills YouTube channel so you never miss any content. And for those of you who like to listen while on the go, we are now available anywhere you listen to podcasts.